have been asked to write this down. That's how they put it, write it down. Like it was simple. Like I could just sit here and put words to what happened inside Cormalith Station and have those words mean anything close to the truth. The senator who gave me this assignment is a Dravathi, which means she has 4 lungs and a brain that processes grief differently than mine does. She smiled when she handed me the datapad and said, "Take your time." I'm a human. I don't process grief differently. I just feel it all at once and then I keep moving because that's what we do. That's always been what we do. My name is Warrant Officer Delia Voss, GEA Special Recovery Unit, assigned to the 9th Sector Border Cluster. I'm 31 years old. I've been operating in interstellar law enforcement for 6 years, and in that 6 years I've seen things that would make the average Terran citizen wake up screaming. I don't say that to sound tough. I say it because it's relevant. It tells you that by the time the Cormalith incident happened, I had a high baseline for terrible. I had calibrated myself to handle terrible things on an almost daily basis. What happened on Cormalith Station broke that calibration completely. Not because it was the worst thing I'd ever seen, but because it was the moment that I understood, really understood, in my bones, in the marrow, what it means to be human in a galaxy that still hasn't figured us out. Let me start from before. The Cormalith cluster sits at the edge of Sector 9's habitable zone, which is the polite way of saying it sits at the edge of where decent civilizations bother to maintain infrastructure. Past Cormalith, the stars thin out. The transit lanes get loose and badly mapped. The kind of ships that use those lanes are mostly people who don't want to be found. The station itself, Cormalith Station, officially designated KM9 in GEA records, was built by the Dranathi Collective about 200 years ago, before the collective fragmented and became 3 separate species with 3 separate grudges, and 1 shared crumbling infrastructure problem. The station was meant to be a refueling hub. It became a smuggling hub, which is what happens to refueling hubs at the edge of polite space when nobody's watching closely enough. By the time I arrived, the station had about 4,000 permanent residents, several hundred more transient dockworkers and traders, and a GEA field office with a staff of 9. 9 officers, 4,400 people, and that's not even counting the part of the station that the GEA didn't technically have access to, the lower 3 decks, which were controlled by the Thurvak Syndicate, and which contained God knows what behind blast doors that hadn't been opened in official capacity since before I was born. I was sent to KM9 on what was classified as a Tier 2 surveillance assignment, which means someone above my pay grade had decided that something on Cormalith Station was worth watching, but not worth deploying significant resources toward. They sent me instead. I was the significant resource. I was the one resource they were willing to risk. Looking back, I'm not sure if that's flattering or insulting. My cover was a freight broker named Maurice Delaine, a fake Terran identity with a plausible history, 3 years of fake transaction records, and a reputation for moving cargo that other brokers considered too hot or too weird. I had a small office on Deck 7, a 2-room sleeping unit attached to it, and a cover story that I'd been running in Sector 9 for 3 months before Cormalith. The actual target was a Thurvak named Gorek Svel. He was the Syndicate's logistics chief for a suspected bioweapon supply chain, a chain that GEA intelligence believed ran through Cormalith and connected to at least 4 active conflict zones in the outer sectors. We needed evidence. We needed names. We needed the chain, not just one link. So I waited. I played the role. I ate bad food in the station's single-functioning food hall and made friends with the dock supervisors and learned which Thurvak junior officers liked gambling and which ones liked to talk about their bosses when they'd had enough to drink. For 11 weeks I waited. And then on a Tuesday, which is a human concept that nobody on Cormalith cared about, but which I tracked privately because it kept me sane, things went sideways. Chapter 2: The door closes. The person who burned my cover was named Sevtral. He was a Vethani data broker who I'd been using as an information source for 6 weeks. He had good access, reasonable prices, and a nervous energy that I'd always found slightly off-putting, but had attributed to the general anxiety of being a small fish in a very dirty pond. Turns out the anxiety was guilt. He'd sold me to Goraxvel 3 days before the incident. He'd taken the money, gone quiet, and let the pieces fall. I found out the way you usually find out about these things. Too late, and in the worst possible place. I was in the lower transit corridor on Deck 4, one level above the sealed Thurvak decks, meeting with a dockworker contact who'd said he had shipping manifests I needed to see. The dockworker never showed. Instead, I got 6 Thurvak soldiers in enforcement gear and a blocking formation that cut off both ends of the corridor in about 3 seconds. It was clean, practiced, they'd done it before. The lead Thurvak was a female named Vrethkaz. I know her name now, from later testimony. At the time, she was just a wall of gray-green body armor and the flat, analytical eyes that Thurvak use when they've decided something is already finished. Thurvak eyes don't show emotion the way most species do. They go flat. It means their mind is settled. It means whatever computation they're running has reached a conclusion, and they're just executing it now. Her eyes were very flat. "Maurice Delenn," she said. She didn't phrase it as a question. "That's me," I said. "No," she said, "it isn't." She had a device in her hand, a biometric scanner, GEA issue, which meant someone had gotten it from inside a GEA facility and given it to the syndicate, which was its own whole problem I'd have to deal with later. She held it up, and it beeped once, and the light on it turned red, which meant it had identified my actual biometrics against the cover ones and found the discrepancy. "Warrant Officer Voss," she said, "GEA Special Recovery 9th Sector." The soldiers behind her shifted, not nervous shifting, readiness shifting, like dogs that have heard a command being formed. "I'd like to see your warrant for that scanner," I said. Vrethkaz looked at me for a moment with those flat eyes, and then she tilted her head slightly, which in Thurvak body language means I find this interesting. "You are making a joke," she said. "A little one," I admitted. "Come with us," she said. She didn't say or else. She didn't need to. The 6 soldiers and the blocked corridor said it for her. I went with them. I had a panic trigger embedded in my left upper molar. A single hard bite would send a compressed emergency signal to the GEA field office. I didn't use it. The field office had 9 officers, a working distress protocol, and a response time of approximately 14 minutes. In 14 minutes, 6 Thurvak soldiers in a sealed corridor could do a lot of things to a human body. I decided the signal was a last resort. They took me down. One deck down, then another, and then through a blast door that opened with a code I didn't have and hadn't been able to get, and into the lower station. The Thurvak decks. The first thing I noticed was the gravity. It was slightly heavier down here, Thurvak standard, which runs about 1.2 Earth, which doesn't sound like much, but you feel it in your knees immediately. The second thing I noticed was the smell. Engine oil and something biological I couldn't identify, sweet and faintly wrong. The way things smell when they've been sealed away from circulation for too long. The third thing I noticed was the size of the operation. I had known, in the abstract sense of intelligence briefings and satellite-mapped heat signatures, that the lower decks of Kormalith Station were substantial, but walking through them was different. The Thurvak had built an entire parallel station down here, warehouse bays the size of hangars, processing facilities with equipment I recognized as pharmaceutical grade, and some I didn't recognize at all. Cold storage banks that went on, rows and rows of sealed containers with biohazard markings in Thurvak script and GA violation codes I'd studied, but never expected to see in person. I had stumbled into something much larger than a logistics operation. Goraxvel was waiting in what appeared to be a command center, a circular room with screens covering every surface, showing feeds from across the station. Security feeds, I realized. Including, I noticed with a particular kind of cold feeling, a feed from my office on Deck 7, and another from my sleeping unit, and a third from the food hall I used every morning. They'd been watching me, not for 3 days, for much longer than 3 days. Goraxvel was large even by Thurvek standards, which meant he was very large. The Thurvek are a species that evolved in high-gravity environments with active predator pressure, and it shows. He had the broad, heavy build, the scaled skin in overlapping plates, the arms that are slightly too long in proportion. He was seated when I came in, which was a power statement. He didn't feel the need to stand for me, and he was holding a cup of something that steamed faintly. He looked at me for a while. "Warrant Officer Voss," he said. His translation implant gave his voice a lower register than his natural one, which was a status choice. High-status Thurvak use low vocal registers in speech. I expected someone older. "Disappointing," I said. "I've been told I have a very mature presence." "You were in my station for 11 weeks," he said. "Eating in my food hall, using my maintenance corridors, talking to my workers. I was establishing rapport." "You were building a case," he said, "against me for GEA intelligence." He paused. "You found very little, I think." "We were careful." I didn't say anything. "The case you were building," he said, "is now over. You are now a complication. A complication I need to decide what to do with." "You could let me go," I offered. "Pretend this never happened. I file an inconclusive report. GEA moves on." He looked at me with an expression I couldn't fully read. Thurvak faces don't map to human emotional cues cleanly. But there was something in it that might have been almost amused. "You do not believe that is what will happen," he said. "No," I admitted, "I don't." "Correct," he said. He stood then, finally, all 7 feet of him, all the heavy, plated mass of him, and moved to one of the screens. He pulled up something I couldn't see from where I was standing. "I have a room for you," he said. "You will stay there while I determine the best resolution to this situation. Your communication devices have been removed." He glanced at Vrethkaz, "including the dental implant." I ran my tongue over my left upper molar. "Gone." I hadn't felt them take it. Somewhere between the corridor and the blast door, they'd sedated me briefly. The half-second of blurred vision I'd attributed to adrenaline, and removed it with enough precision that I hadn't noticed. The cold feeling got colder. "The best resolution," I said. "Does that involve keeping me alive?" Goraxvel tilted his head, the same gesture Vrethkaz had made, Thurvak thinking gesture. "It may," he said. "You are a GEA officer. Killing GEA officers creates problems. Trading them creates opportunities." He paused. "We will see." Chapter 3: The Room. The room they put me in was a storage container. A modified one. Someone had cut ventilation holes in the top and bolted a cot to one wall and added a sanitation unit in the corner that worked about 60% of the time. There was a light strip that stayed on continuously. There was nothing else. The door was 6 centimeters of solid duralloy, with a magnetic lock that I heard click into a secondary lock after the first one engaged. They weren't taking chances. The ventilation holes were 4 centimeters across, I checked, because of course I checked, and opened into ducting that I could hear but couldn't access. One guard outside the door. Possibly 2. I heard breathing that overlapped in a way that suggested 2 bodies, but Thurvak have slightly asynchronous breathing patterns when they're standing still, so it might have been 1. I sat on the cot and took inventory. My personal equipment was gone, all of it, including the items I'd had in concealed pockets, which meant they'd done a thorough search while I was sedated. My cover credentials were gone. My sidearm, obviously, was gone. My embedded comm relay was gone. What I had, my own body, my own mind, 6 years of GEA special recovery training, and 11 weeks of intelligence about Cormalith Station that I'd spent every day building and memorizing, because I'm a professional, and professionals don't put everything on a device that can be taken. I also had time. That's the thing nobody tells you about being captured in hostile territory. Everyone imagines the dramatic escape, the action, the movement. They don't imagine the hours before any of that. The sitting, the listening, the mapping of sounds through walls, of schedules from the rhythm of footsteps, of structural information from the faint vibrations of a station's systems that you can feel if you press your back against the right wall. I pressed my back against the wall. I listened. Here's what I learned in the first 4 hours. The station's ventilation system ran on a 22-minute cycle. I could track it by the change in air pressure against my face when the cycle shifted. This meant the ducting was pressurized on alternating cycles, which meant there were periods of equalized pressure during the transition. The guards changed at what felt like 8-hour intervals, Thurvak's standard shift structure. I tracked it by the difference in the 2 voices I could occasionally hear through the door in what I suspected were handoff conversations. Somewhere 2 containers over, something was being processed. A rhythmic mechanical sound, consistent, industrial. I felt it as much as heard it. Every 40 minutes it stopped for exactly 4 minutes and then resumed. The lighting in my container was tied to the station's main power. I could feel the faint flicker that indicated power cycling, and it was out of sync with the ventilation by about 3 minutes, which told me the lower decks had been retrofitted with their own power infrastructure that wasn't perfectly synchronized with the station's original grid. None of this was immediately useful. All of it was potentially crucial. I kept cataloging. At the 6-hour mark, someone opened the door and pushed in a food container sealed Thurvak rations, which I ate because you eat when you can, and then closed it again without speaking. The person who brought it was shorter than the guards, moved differently, and wore what sounded like softer sole coverings. Probably a civilian worker, rather than an enforcement officer. At the 8-hour mark, I heard the handoff conversation clearly enough to catch 3 words in Thurvak that I recognized. Voss, which was my name, delay, and courier. Courier. Gorek Svel was making arrangements. He was going to trade me, which meant he'd made contact with someone who wanted me, which meant there was a buyer somewhere out there in the dark of Sector 9 who had a use for a captured GEA officer. That changed the timeline. As long as I was a local complication, I had time. The moment a courier was confirmed, the moment someone was coming to collect me, my window closed. Because whoever was coming to collect me would not be on Cormalith Station's ground, playing by its complicated rules and worried about GEA complications. They'd be mobile, they'd be motivated, and they'd be far more difficult to read than a station boss who had, at least, a fixed operation to protect. I needed to move faster. Chapter 4: Mathematics of Escape. I want to be clear about something. I am not a superhero. I know that's an odd thing to say in the middle of what is apparently becoming an escape narrative, but it matters. I've heard humans described by other species as some kind of unreasonable physical force. Death worlders, the HFY crowd calls us, which is both flattering and wildly overstated. And while there's something true in it, the truth is more specific and less cinematic than the reputation. What humans are, physiologically, is stubborn. We don't give up on a cellular level. Our pain tolerance is genuinely unusual, not because we don't feel pain, but because we've evolved to function through it. Our endurance capacity is extraordinary in long-distance contexts. And we have something that doesn't show up in most species profiles, but that any xenobiologist worth their credentials will confirm. Humans have a remarkable ability to tolerate stress hormones, without the cognitive shutdown that those hormones cause in most other species. Put a Thervac under enough stress, and their threat processing centers start to narrow their focus. They get better at dealing with the immediate problem and worse at dealing with the context around it. It's actually adaptive in short-burst survival situations. It means they execute well in a crisis. Put a human under enough stress, and we get creative. That's not actually a compliment, it's a description. It's a neurological quirk that probably evolved because our ancestors needed to survive in environments that were actively trying to kill them in many different simultaneous ways, and you can't solve a multi-pronged threat with tunnel vision. You solve it with lateral thinking under pressure. You solve it by using what you have in ways it wasn't meant to be used. I had a container, a cot, a sanitation unit, ventilation holes, and a 22-minute pressure cycle in the ducting. Let me tell you what I did with that. The cot was bolted to the wall, but the bolts were Drenathi manufacture, the original station material, not the Thervac retrofitting. Drenathi fasteners use a hexagonal drive system that requires a specific tool. I didn't have the tool. But I had the food container from my meal, which was a pressed fiber composite that, when the edge was worked against the bolt head repeatedly, created just enough of a channel to use as an improvised hex key. It took 2 hours and most of the skin off 2 of my knuckles. The first bolt came free, then the second. The cot frame was then a loose metal structure that I could move carefully, quietly away from the wall. The cot frame was aluminum alloy, light, hollow, with segmented cross supports. I disassembled 2 of the cross supports. Each one was about 40 centimeters long and had a slight natural bow to it. The ventilation holes were 4 centimeters across. My arm was not 4 centimeters across. But 2 cross supports fitted together at an angle and worked into the corner of the ventilation frame. The part where the metal of the container met the metal of the duct housing created leverage on a seam that had been welded, not bolted. And that weld was Thervac work, which is fast and hot and not as structurally sound as it looks. The first time I applied pressure to the seam, it didn't move. The second time, it moved a millimeter. The third time I heard it, a very faint, very quiet sound like a slow exhale of metal. I worked on the seam during the mechanical pauses, every 40 minutes for 4 minutes. Because during those 4 minutes, the rhythmic industrial sound next door stopped, and the ambient noise of the lower deck was at its lowest, and anyone listening for unusual sounds was least likely to notice a faint metallic stress noise behind the ventilation. Between pauses, I rested. I ate the second food container they brought. I lay on the bare floor where the cot had been and did breathing exercises that I learned in my second year of training from a Terran instructor named Sergeant Chandra, who said that controlled breathing is the difference between thinking in a crisis and panicking in one. Sergeant Chandra was right about most things. I thought about the layout of the lower decks, what I'd seen during the walk from the transit corridor to the command center. The warehouse bays, the cold storage, the processing facility, the specific angle and distance from the command center to the container where I was being held, which I estimated was about 200 meters and 3 structural bays. I thought about the courier, how long it would take to arrange one. If Gorexvel had someone already in mind, he'd have made contact immediately the night of my capture. If he was shopping around, if he was trying to get the best price, it would take longer. 2 days minimum, possibly 4. I had heard the word on hour 6. I needed to assume the fastest possible timeline. 1 day. Maybe less. On the third mechanical pause cycle, approximately 2 hours into my work, the seam gave. Not dramatically, not with a crash. It gave the way metal gives when it's been properly worked. A slow yielding, a release of tension, and then a gap. 6 centimeters of gap at the bottom corner of the ventilation frame, where the duct housing met the container wall. I put my face to the gap and looked. The duct was dark and about 50 centimeters across, not large, but large enough for me to move through if I was willing to do things to my shoulder joints that my body would hold against me for the next week. The ducting ran horizontal from my container and then appeared to T-junction about 3 meters down. I could feel the air pressure differential that meant the cycle was going to shift in about 4 minutes. I couldn't take anything with me. The metal cross supports were too loud to carry in a duct. I left them. I pushed through the gap. The inside of a ventilation duct in a retrofitted cargo station smells like a combination of machine lubricant, recycled atmosphere, and whatever the last living thing to use it was doing there. Something had been using this duct. I chose not to think about what. I moved the way I'd been trained to move in confined spaces, slow, deliberate, weight distributed, no fast shifts that create noise. My shoulders did not appreciate it. My knees did not appreciate it. The duct was hot in a way that had nothing to do with ventilation and everything to do with being metal inside a space that had been running industrial equipment for decades. The T-junction was where I'd estimated it, left or right. I pressed my ear to the right branch and listened. The mechanical sound was coming from the right, the processing facility. That meant workers, possibly exits, definitely things I could use. I went right. The duct ran parallel to the floor for about 15 meters and then angled downward, unexpected, but manageable, and then opened into a grill about 2 meters above a processing floor. I looked through the grill. Below me, a room about the size of a warehouse bay but fitted out as a biological processing facility. Banks of sealed containers moving on automated tracks. Workers, Thurvac, 6 of them that I could count, plus 2 that might have been a different species, possibly Drenathi in protective gear, managing the tracks. No obvious enforcement presence in the room itself. One exit door on the far wall, another door closer to my position on the left wall. Above the left door, a security panel, red light, locked. The panel design was GA standard, which again told me about the stolen or bought equipment problem, but also told me something more immediately useful. I knew GA standard panel overrides. They were the kind of override that was built into the system for emergency access by officers in the field, and while the Thurvac had clearly acquired the hardware, there was very little reason to think they'd acquired the override codes along with it. If the panel was standard, the override was standard. If the override was standard, the door opened. The question was getting to it without being seen by 6 workers and 2 possible additional somethings in a room with no concealment. I kept looking. The automated track system ran close to the left wall, close enough that a person moving along the wall while the worker's attention was on the main track line might be below their primary visual field. The protective gear the workers wore included full face masks, visibility reducing, and the lighting in the processing facility was intense over the main work area and significantly dimmer along the walls. Possible, not guaranteed, but possible. I worked the grill loose. It was held by 4 clips, not screws, designed for access, not security. I counted the workers' attention cycles. They moved in a pattern, 2 at the track intake, 2 managing the central banks, 2 at the output. They rotated every few minutes in a steady rhythm. I waited for the moment when all 6 were concentrated toward the center. Then I dropped. 2 meters. I landed the way you land when you've trained for landing, controlled, absorbed through the legs, already moving. I was against the left wall before the sound of my landing had finished echoing. Nobody turned. I moved along the wall. The automated track covered the ambient noise. I got to the security panel in 11 seconds. The override code was a 6-digit sequence. I entered it. The light went green. I went through the door. The corridor on the other side of the processing room door was empty. This is the thing that intelligence training teaches you to distrust most. The empty corridor. Because empty corridors are never empty for one reason. They're empty because the schedule worked out that way, or because the guards are at the end of their shift and getting slow, or because something happened somewhere else that pulled attention, or because you're walking into something that's waiting for you. I moved fast and stayed low, and tried not to hope too hard. The corridor branched. I chose the branch that angled upward, because I needed to get back to the transition zone between the Thurvac decks and the rest of the station. The blast door I'd come through was the obvious choke point, but there had been a second door, smaller, marked with a maintenance symbol, about 20 meters to the left of the main blast door. Maintenance access. The Thurvac had probably secured it, but maintenance doors in old Dranatha-built stations were often tied to different circuit systems than the main security infrastructure. It was a gamble. I was down to gambles. I moved. The next 8 minutes were the kind of 8 minutes that I have replayed many times since, and that still cause a physiological response I prefer not to describe in a formal report, but which the medical staff at the GEA debrief facility accurately identified as post-traumatic stress indicators. I will simply say, I was not unseen. On the second corridor junction, I encountered a single Thurvac guard who was moving in the opposite direction, and who saw me at approximately the same moment I saw him. He was large. They are always large. He had about 40 kilos on me and 4 centimeters in arm span. He also had approximately 100 milliseconds of processing time before I was past the point where he could make a grab for me, because he spent his first processing time on why is this human out of the container, and I spent mine on move, and humans, as I have said, perform differently under stress. I went under his reaching arm, hit the wall to change my angle, and was running before he completed the grab. He shouted, "That was expected." The alarm came 20 seconds later, a pulsing Thurvac alert tone that I felt more than heard, vibrating through the floor and the walls. I ran faster. The maintenance door was where I'd calculated it. A smaller door, older, with a mechanical wheel lock backup that the Thurvac had secured with a simple padlock. Their own design, a physical deterrent against anyone who'd cracked the electronic systems, which was actually good thinking, and which would have stopped someone who hadn't spent 2 hours with their face pressed against a ventilation gap, studying the architecture of the corridor beyond. There was about 4 centimeters of space between the bottom of the door and the floor, enough to see through, enough to verify that the corridor beyond was the transition zone. The padlock was a physical padlock. I didn't have a key or a pick. I had my hands. I had a good understanding of where the shackle seated in the body of the lock. I had training from a GEA instructor named Kowalski, who had a particular philosophy about physical locks that I won't reproduce here, but whose essential conclusion was, a lock is only as strong as the weakest part of its seating. The door frame was old Dranatha construction. The Thurvac had bolted the padlock hasp to it, but the bolts were going into aging metal, and they'd only used 2 bolts, and the upper bolt showed the microfracturing that happens when heavy machinery vibration runs through a structure for decades. The upper bolt came out of the frame. The hasp pulled away from the door. The door swung open. The transition zone was, as its name implied, the space between the Thurvac lower decks and the rest of Cormalith Station, between secured and unsecured, between the part of the station where I was a prisoner and the part where I was, technically, still an undercover officer with a cover identity, even if that cover was now blown. The main blast door was closed and would require the code I didn't have. There were 2 Thurvac enforcement officers visible in the zone, not the ones who had been guarding my container, different ones. And they had not yet reacted to the alert because the alert was Thurvac internal, and the transition zone was, acoustically, somewhat insulated from the lower decks. I had maybe 60 seconds before someone communicated the alert up here manually. One of the officers was near the blast door. The other was near a bank of equipment on the far side of the zone, diagnostic equipment for the airlock systems, I thought, which meant there was an airlock on the far side, which meant there was exterior hull access, which meant... No, that was a last resort of a last resort. I wasn't going EVA without a suit on a station at the edge of Sector 9. I pushed that option to the back and kept looking. The ceiling of the transition zone was higher than the lower deck corridors. The station's original architecture, before the Thurvac had installed their low ceilings. And in the original architecture, there were utility rails, overhead rails for moving large cargo in the early station days, that ran from the blast door all the way to the far wall, and through a wide service opening into what I was fairly certain was the station's main freight corridor. The service opening was wide enough for a cargo container. It was not locked. It was about 5 meters up. I looked at the equipment bank near the airlock officer. There was a stacked series of diagnostic units, modular, stackable, each about 60 centimeters in height and meant to be freestanding. I did the math. 4 units stacked, 240, plus my own height, another 160. Total reach if I jumped from the top unit, 4 meters with a stretched arm. Close, not quite. The Thurvac officer at the blast door turned in my direction. Not seeing me yet, I was in the shadow of the door frame, but the movement was in my direction. 60 seconds had run out. I ran for the equipment bank. Here is where I need to say something about the Thurvac perception system, because it's relevant to what happened next, and because the GEA xenobiology briefings make it clear, but the briefings are long, and people don't always read them completely. Thurvac visual processing is optimized for movement detection at middle range. They're extraordinary at detecting something moving across their field of vision at the 15 to 50 meter range. At close range, inside 10 meters, and at very fast movement speeds, their visual processing system has a brief lag. It's maybe a quarter second, not much. But a quarter second matters. I covered the 15 meters to the equipment bank before either officer completed a full visual lock on my position. One of them shouted, I heard it, the hard Thurvac consonants of an alert command, and I was already climbing. 2 units up. 3. Something hit the 4th unit as I reached the top. A grab, heavy-handed, pulling the unit's base. The stack lurched. I jumped. I am, as I said, not a superhero. I am a woman who is 163 centimeters tall and who has been doing this job for 6 years, which has included physical training standards that GEA SRU uses to weed out officers who aren't prepared for what the job actually involves. I cleared the gap to the utility rail by about 8 centimeters. My hands caught the rail. The rail held. I pulled. Behind me, the equipment stack hit the floor with a sound like a percussion instrument the size of a transport vehicle. One of the officers was shouting into a comm. The other was looking up at me with those flat, settled Thurvac eyes. I pulled myself along the rail, hand over hand. The service opening got closer. The first shot missed me by what the trajectory analysis later determined was approximately 30 centimeters, which at the time felt like no centimeters at all. It was a containment round, not lethal, but designed to tangle and bring down a moving target. It hit the rail about 1/3 of a meter behind my hands and wrapped itself around the rail and seized. I was already past it. The service opening was ahead of me. I let go of the rail and dropped, and I was in the freight corridor, and the freight corridor led to Deck 5, and Deck 5 led up, and up led to the part of the station where I had resources. Chapter 8 Assets. Let me tell you about the GEA field office on Cormalith Station. 9 officers. I've mentioned this. What I haven't mentioned is that among those 9 officers, there was a Terran, a human, the only other human on the station in official capacity. A man named Senior Analyst Petrov, who had been stationed on KM9 for almost 3 years, and who knew the station the way I know my own face in the mirror. Petrov was not a field officer, he was an analyst. He was 58 years old and had a knee that had been badly damaged in an incident 14 years ago, and that he had declined surgery on because he said he preferred the pain to the recovery time. He was the kind of person who could tell you the complete maintenance schedule of every airlock on Deck 3 from memory, and who knew which food hall vendors were using substandard recycling, because he'd cross-referenced the station's waste management data with the vendor certifications. He was also the person who had built most of my intelligence infrastructure for the Goraxvel assignment, working remotely, before I'd arrived. When my cover was burned and I was taken, Petrov had noticed within 4 hours. I know this because he told me later. He had noticed because the sensors he'd placed, legal GEA surveillance tech, micro-passive, woven into the public areas of the station, had stopped picking up my biometric trace, and then the pattern of movements in the lower transit corridor on the night of my capture had told him what had happened. He had not panicked. This is relevant. He had done what an experienced analyst does when a field officer goes missing in hostile territory. He had quietly, methodically begun building options. He could not call in GEA reinforcements. Standard procedure was 72 hours before escalating a missing officer situation, to avoid burning active operations, and that 72 hours wasn't up yet. He could not approach the Thervac zone directly. 9 officers versus an unknown number of syndicate enforcement, with no warrant and no jurisdiction in the lower decks, was not a survivable situation. What he could do was prepare the station above the line for a possible emergence event. He had placed alert protocols on every cargo lift between Deck 5 and Deck 2. He had established quiet contact with the Deck 6 dock supervisor, a Vethani named Orasu, who was one of my intelligence assets and who had no love for the Thervac, and had been waiting for an opportunity to be useful in a way that didn't get her killed. He had remotely accessed the GEA's confiscated equipment locker on Deck 3 and positioned materials I might need. He had, in short, set a stage. He just hadn't known when or whether I was going to be able to walk onto it. I came up from the freight corridor onto Deck 5 via a cargo lift that beeped twice when it registered my GEA biometrics, Petrov's alert protocol, confirming to him that I was moving. I didn't know about the protocol yet. I just heard the beep and hoped it wasn't a Thervac alarm. Deck 5 smelled like the rest of the station above the line, recycled air, cooking smells from the food hall 2 decks up, the general lived-in atmosphere of 4,400 people sharing a sealed environment. It smelled wonderful. My hands were bleeding. My shoulder joints were going to be spectacular bruises by morning. I had been awake for approximately 18 hours. I kept moving. The GEA equipment locker on Deck 3 was a storage unit that the field office used for confiscated materials pending transfer to headquarters. It was locked on a GEA-only biometric, which meant my biometrics opened it, which meant Petrov's preparation assumption was correct. Inside, a replacement sidearm standard issue, a GEA field kit with medical basics, communication equipment, and a replacement embedded comm relay waiting for installation, 3 data cards, a sealed envelope with VOSS written on it in Petrov's handwriting. I opened the envelope. The note inside said, Dock 14, Deck 2. 1 hour from now or 2 hours from now she alternates. You'll know when, P. She Orasu, the dock supervisor. I looked at the equipment. I administered the worst field application of a comm relay I have ever done. Petrov had included a local anesthetic for the injection site, which I appreciated enormously, and took the sidearm and the data cards and went to find Deck 2. I want to be precise about the timeline here, because the Galactic Enforcement Authority's own after-action review got some of it wrong, And the Senate Oversight Committee got even more of it wrong. And the Thurvac Syndicate's legal team got essentially all of it wrong in ways that I believe were deliberate. When I reached Dock 14 on Deck 2, the time was approximately 0400 station standard. The station's transit day was 6 hours away from beginning. The docks were at their quietest. Orasu was there. She was a small, quick-moving Vethani with markings across her face that I'd learned to read as something between worry and determination. She saw me and her markings shifted, something like relief, I thought. She said, in Vethani, that my translation implant caught most of, something that translated roughly as, "You look terrible." "I've had better nights," I agreed. She handed me a drink, something hot, Vethani sourced, that tasted like burned sugar and made my nervous system very happy, and said, "The big ship came in 40 minutes ago." "What big ship?" She described it. "Galactic Enforcement Authority Cruiser Threshold Class," she said, which was the largest class of enforcement vessel the GEA deployed in sector operations. Not the standard patrol craft that covered Sector 9. Not the response unit that would have come for a missing officer. A threshold class, which meant intelligence had escalated this above the 72-hour protocol, which meant someone at GEA Central had known something was wrong before Petrov's alert would have gone up, which meant there was a larger operation happening that I was part of, or that I had been the trigger for. "How many troops?" I asked. "I counted 40 boarding ramps extending," Orasu said. "A full assault deployment." I processed this. The Thurvac Syndicate operation on Kormalith Station, the full scale of it, the bioweapon supply chain, the cold storage banks and the pharmaceutical-grade processing and the columns of biohazard containers, was almost certainly bigger than the Goraxvel case had suggested. The GEA had sent a threshold class cruiser with full assault capacity. That was not a response to one missing officer. That was a response to something they'd known about, or suspected, for much longer than my 11 weeks on the station. I had been a probe. Not in the way that felt cruel, exactly. More in the way that sometimes an operation requires a visible piece that draws the target's attention and response, so that the invisible pieces can complete their positioning. I had been sent in to surface the operation. My capture had confirmed it was real and significant, and now the GEA had arrived to actually deal with it. Which meant the next phase was about to begin. Which meant the station was about to become a very complicated place to be. "Where's Petrov?" I asked. "Meeting the boarding officers," Orasu said. "He asked me to tell you something." She paused, consulting her memory. "He said, the Thurvac are going to try to move their most valuable assets before the GEA secures the lower decks. There's a 20-minute window between when they figure out what's happening and when GEA units reach the blast door. Whatever is in those cold storage banks needs to not leave the station in that window." 20 minutes. The GEA cruiser was here. The assault deployment was beginning. In 20 minutes, the Thurvac would know, if they didn't already, that a threshold class was docked and troops were moving. And Goraxvel, who was not stupid, would activate whatever contingency he had for exactly this scenario, which probably involved putting the most sensitive, most incriminating materials, the cold storage contents, the bioweapon chain evidence, onto a small, fast vessel, and getting it off the station before the GEA could establish a legal hold on the docking systems. I thought about the cold storage banks, the rows and rows of sealed containers with biohazard markings. I thought about the evidence, what it would mean if Goraxvel got it off station, what it would mean for the conflict zones it was heading to, what it would mean for every investigation the GEA would try to build afterward without it. "Orasu," I said, "does the station have a central cargo routing terminal?" She looked at me for a moment. Then she said, "Bay Control Deck 1. Can you get me there?" Her markings did something complicated. "I can get you there," she said. "What are you going to do?" "Lock the docking system," I said. "All of it. Every bay, every airlock, every transit lock. Nothing leaves the station." "You'll lock out the GEA boarding craft too," she said. "Petrov can override from the cruiser side," I said. "They have GEA master codes. I just need to lock it long enough that nothing leaves in that 20-minute window." She thought about it. Her markings shifted again, settling into something I read as okay. "Let's do the thing that might get me killed." "Come on," she said. Bay Control on Deck 1 was the station's nerve center for all docking operations. It was staffed at 0400 by 2 operators, both Vethani, which was standard for Kormalith's above-the-line technical operations, and it ran the transit lock system for every docking port on the station. The transit lock system was a GEA-mandated safety feature. In emergency situations, GEA officers could activate a station-wide transit lock that froze all docking operations, no departures, no arrivals, nothing in or out until the lock was lifted. The system was in every certified station in Sector 9. To activate it, you needed GEA credentials and the station emergency code. I had the credentials. I didn't have the emergency code. The emergency code was a rotating 12-digit sequence that changed every 6 hours and was transmitted to registered GEA field personnel at each rotation. My embedded comm relay had been removed while I was sedated. The replacement relay that Petrov had left in the equipment locker was new and hadn't yet been registered to receive the current rotation. I could request it from the GEA cruiser. The cruiser was there, but that required establishing contact, establishing authentication, getting the code transmitted, receiving it on a relay that might not yet be fully integrated, all of which took time. Time was the thing I did not have. Orosu had brought me to the Deck 1 corridor outside Bay Control. We were standing in the corner of the corridor, looking through the window at the 2 operators and the large circular bank of the transit lock panel. "There's another way to activate it," Orosu said. I looked at her. "Physical emergency activation," she said. "The panel has a physical switch, red cover. It was in the original Drenathi design and the GEA never removed it when they standardized the system." She paused. "The physical switch doesn't require a code. It requires the switch to be held in the open position for 30 seconds. Then it locks automatically." "Why doesn't everyone know about this?" I said. "Most people don't read the original Drenathi engineering documents," she said. "I've been running this dock for 11 years. I read everything." I looked through the window at the 2 operators, at the large circular panel, at the red cover in the top right quadrant of the panel. "Can you give me 30 seconds in that room?" I asked. Orosu looked at the operators. Then she said something in Vethani that my translation implant caught as, "I can give you 25. You'll have to account for 5 yourself." Then she walked through the door. I watched her through the window. She was talking to the operators, something animated in her manner, the Vethani equivalent of urgency. Both operators turned to face her. I went through the door. The panel was exactly where she'd said it was. The red cover was a physical flip cover. I lifted it, and the switch was a large toggle, worn from decades of testing, and I grabbed it and held it and kept my back to the operators and kept very still. 1 second, 5, 10. Behind me, I heard Orosu still talking. I heard one of the operators saying something in a questioning tone. 15 seconds, 20. I heard the other operator say something sharper, and then I heard footsteps. 25 seconds. A hand landed on my shoulder. One of the operators, heavy and pulling, and I held the switch, and the panel around it began to pulse, a low amber sequence that meant the lock was initiating. 30 seconds. The pulse went red. A tone sounded low, station-wide. The transit lock tone I'd read about in the GEA procedures manual and never expected to activate personally. I let go of the switch. The operator who had hold of my shoulder said something I didn't need a translation for. I turned around with my hands visible and my GEA credentials already up on the display panel of the new comm relay. "Warrant Officer Voss," I said. "GEA Special Recovery 9th Sector. The station is now under emergency transit lock. If you'd like to file a complaint about the way I activated it, I'll give you the form number." The operator stared at me. The tone kept sounding. "Here is what happened in the lower decks during the next 40 minutes, as reconstructed from GEA incident records, Thurvac prisoner testimony, and the sensor logs that Petrov had been running the entire time." When the transit lock tone sounded, Gorexvel understood what it meant immediately. He was, as I've said, not stupid. He had contingency plans. The contingency plan for GEA locks the station was move to the emergency extraction protocol, which involved a sealed submersible cargo pod designed to detach from the station's underside through the original Drenathi emergency separation ports. The pod had its own propulsion, could reach the nearest transit relay in about 16 hours, and contained a pre-packed selection of the most critical materials from the cold storage banks. He had never actually tested the emergency extraction protocol. He had run simulations. He had equipment checks. He had personnel drills. He had not accounted for the fact that the transit lock, which he thought only covered docking ports, also, in the original Drenathi engineering design that Orasu had spent 11 years reading, covered the emergency separation ports. The submersible cargo pod fired its release charges. The separation port did not open. The pod sat in its bay. Gorexvel spent several minutes trying to override the separation port manually. He could not. The transit lock had engaged the physical bolt system, a pneumatic bolt, old Drenathi manufacture, that could only be released from bay control. He then made a decision that I believe he has regretted since. He decided to fight his way to bay control. The GEA assault teams had by then established a perimeter on decks 4 and 5. The blast door between the transition zone and the lower decks was being cut. GEA teams have cutting equipment for exactly this scenario, and threshold class deployments carry it as standard. The cutting was taking time, which was expected. What was not expected, what GEA Tactical Commander Vrethamas later told the Senate Oversight Committee she had not anticipated, was Gorexvel sending a force up through the maintenance access points. The small doors, the ducts, the secondary connections between the lower decks and the upper station. The same maintenance corridors I had used. Because of course he had them mapped. It was his station. He'd spent years building his operation inside it. He knew every maintenance corridor and access point better than I did. 22 Thurvac enforcement officers came up through the maintenance accesses and hit the transition zone from multiple directions simultaneously. They engaged the GEA perimeter from the inside. The GEA perimeter held, barely, and at significant cost. Here is where I need to tell you about something that happened in bay control. When the Thurvac came up through the maintenance corridors, one of them, a unit of 4, it turned out came up through the access point on Deck 1, directly below bay control. I didn't know this was happening until the access hatch on the floor of the corridor outside bay control opened, and the first Thurvac came through it. Orasu was still in the room with me. The 2 operators, both of whom had, after seeing my credentials and hearing the alert tone, and watching the situation develop with the specific look of people who are very good at reading which way things are going, had decided to stand very still in the corner and let the GEA officer handle it. I had the sidearm out already. I'd had it out since the transit lock engaged because I'd known something was probably coming. The first Thurvac through the hatch came up fast and high. They're trained to clear hatch entries at speed, to minimize exposure in the transition. I had approximately 2 seconds before he was fully oriented. I used them. The containment round from my sidearm caught him center mass at close range, which is extremely unpleasant even through body armor, because GEA containment rounds at close range deliver enough kinetic force to stagger a Thervac regardless of the armor. He went down. Not unconscious. Thervac are hard to knock unconscious, but down and trying to process what had happened. The second one came through the hatch and I moved. They'd been expecting a target in a fixed position. I wasn't in the fixed position. The thing about fighting Thervac, and I've done it before, not often, not by choice, is that you cannot match them for mass or arm span. You don't try. What you do is stay inside their optimal engagement range, which is middle distance, where their size gives them the most advantage. You get very close or you get very far. I got very close. The second Thervac had a hand on my arm in about a second and a half. The hand was the size of a dinner plate, and the grip was enough to crack the bones if I fought it directly. I didn't fight it directly. I used the grip as a fulcrum, redirected my own weight, and put everything I had into the back of his knee, the joint where Thervac armor is thinnest because full-range movement requires articulation. He didn't go down, but he buckled. That was enough. Third and fourth were still in the hatch. Hatch clearance requires going one at a time. I had the sidearm back up before the third one finished clearing. They stopped. 4 Thervac enforcement officers. 1 human officer with a containment sidearm, and absolutely no intention of moving from in front of the transit lock panel. We held this arrangement for a very long moment. Then one of the operators from the corner of the room said something in Vethani that my translation implant caught as, "Please don't damage the panel. It's the only one on the station, and it takes 3 years to get a replacement." He came through the hatch himself. I hadn't expected that. Goraxvel was a logistics chief, a boss. He had people for the physical confrontation parts of his operation. He did not, in the intelligence profile I'd been given, have a history of personal direct engagement. But the profile had been written before his submersible pod refused to release, and his station was being cut into by a threshold-class assault deployment. And 4 of his enforcement officers were standing in bay control looking at a human with a sidearm, and apparently failing to simply remove her. He came through the hatch with the kind of energy that I have since only seen a few times, in species and individuals for whom the situation has reached the point where dignity and strategy have been replaced by something more fundamental. He was furious, not flat-eyed. His eyes were not flat anymore. They were wide and active and fixed on me with an expression I had no trouble reading across species boundaries. He was massive, 7 feet and then some, and armored in personal protection gear that was significantly heavier than his enforcement officer's standard kit. He looked at me. I looked at him. Behind him, the 4 enforcement officers seemed to relax slightly, the way subordinates do when the boss arrives, and they expect the boss to simply handle it. "You are still here," Goraxvel said. "I am," I agreed. "You activated the transit lock." "I did." "The separation ports will not open," he said. Something moved across his face, a Thervac expression I couldn't fully read, but that had the shape of something having cost him a great deal. "That's the idea," I said. He looked at the sidearm I was pointing at him. He looked at the transit lock panel behind me. He looked at me again. "You are one person," he said, "alone, in a room, with a weapon that will not kill anyone." "That's true," I said. "You cannot hold this room." "Also probably true," I said, "eventually." "Then why?" he said, and there was something in it that wasn't just anger, something that was genuinely trying to understand. "Are you still standing there?" And I thought about how to answer that. I thought about the cold storage banks and the bioweapon supply chain and the conflict zones. I thought about what was in those sealed containers with the biohazard markings. I thought about what it meant for those materials to get off this station. Because every second I'm standing here, I said, the GEA is another second closer to that blast door. And when they get through it, they're going to find everything. Every container, every record, every name. I paused. Your submersible pod isn't leaving. The evidence isn't leaving. The only thing that gets decided right now is whether you want to add assaulting a GEA officer in the direct commission of her duties to the list of things you're going to be explaining to a Senate tribunal. He stared at me. Stand down, I said. Call your people off the transition zone. Let the GEA teams through. And maybe the fact that you chose to cooperate at the critical moment means something in the proceedings. The room was very quiet. The transit lock tone was still sounding. Low, persistent, the heartbeat of a station that wasn't letting anyone leave. Gorexvel looked at me for a very long time. Then he said something in Thurvak to his enforcement officers. Short, quiet, his voice back to the low register, the status register. The 4 officers stood down.